Hello, and welcome to this how-to session all about how to talk about the news. There's so much news all the time, so often bad news, but it is something that people talk about quite a lot. I'm Ben, and I'm going to be talking you through this topic. So we're looking at current events. Current events is a very common phrase, just meaning things that are in the news at the moment. The latest stories, latest is just the same as most recent. We say news stories, even though a story normally means something that isn't true. A news story is normally something that is true. It's something that's in the news. We'll be looking at whether news items are newsworthy, whether it's right that they're being reported as news, and whether they are trustworthy, whether we can trust them. So we'll get into a few of those terms a little more as we go on. So we have in this image what you might call a newsroom, a room of people all bringing the news together, and it's possible they're looking at the news and finding out, but if they are reporting the news, then this may well be a newsroom. So it starts out looking at newspapers. Everyone used to get the newspaper. They seem a bit less common these days. I don't know whether that's the case in Japan as well. But it's very common still for someone to say, oh, I saw this in the paper, or I saw this in the papers. People say, I saw it in the papers or in the paper, both quite common for saying in the newspaper. Got an image here with a lot of, I think, German newspapers. But I suppose every country has its own styles and papers. So the first word that I'll point out is the headlines. So at the top of an article, you'll have a big headline, very clear explanation of what the story is. So, local man eats hamster. Of course, if you were saying it as a normal sentence, you'd say, a local man eats a hamster. But often headlines are written in briefer writing, in note form, often missing out articles and things like that. Because the thing with a headline is it's got to be catchy, it's got to be punchy, it's got to make people notice and make them buy the newspaper. Almost everything about the way newspapers are presented, at least on the front page, is to make you buy it. So you've got two types of newspapers, two sizes. Broadsheet newspapers, also just called broadsheets, are big newspapers. They're really inconvenient if you try and read them on the train because they are so big. They're becoming less common now because even broadsheet publishers are printing them a bit smaller now. But they tend to be a bit more serious. They tend to be looking at news more seriously. It's a bit more dry. Dry meaning not exciting, not sensational, just clear facts. Whereas on the other hand, tabloid newspapers, or just tabloids, are interested in making everything sensational. They make everything seem exciting. They get criticized because they are full of things that aren't really news. So lots of gossip about who's wearing what, who's put on weight, that sort of thing. That ends up in tabloid newspapers. But they are very popular. They're the most popular newspapers, in fact. And in the UK, at least, tabloids are normally marketed at working class people, whereas broadsheets are more sold to middle class people, although there is a bit of crossover. The UK's most popular newspaper is a tabloid. It's called The Sun. You always see lots of copies of The Sun everywhere, and it has a reading age of 8. The reading age of a book or a newspaper is the age you need to be to understand it. So if you're 8 years old, you can pick up a copy of The Sun and read it and understand everything in it. You might not be able to if you're 6 years old, but you don't need to be an adult to understand all the vocabulary and all the details. So it's deliberately written in a way that makes it very accessible, which is excellent. It means that they can sell very widely and it has a very broad appeal. So that is newspapers. Moving on to TV news. This is a more modern form, I think. And very often you'll turn on the TV and you'll see someone presenting the TV news. You can call them a news presenter or just a presenter. There's a specific term for them as well. They often get called news anchors, especially in America. I think they're an anchor, because like a ship has an anchor, a heavy thing you throw off the ship to get stuck on the bottom of the sea and keep the ship in one place. With news anchors, you keep going to other places, but it always comes back to the anchor. They are the one solid thing that stays in the same place and you can rely on. So anchor is a word that can sort of represent something that is solid and doesn't go away and will always be there. But yes, they are news anchors. When you're talking about watching the news, you can say, I saw it on the news is very common. I watched the news is a bit more active. It means I deliberately watched it. I deliberately tuned in because I wanted to see that specific thing. So I watched a news report because I knew my brother was going to be on TV in it because he'd committed a terrible crime. But if it's more passive, if you didn't sit down deliberately to see it, you just happened to see it because you were watching TV and, then it was in front of you and you learnt it, but you hadn't planned to. Then I saw it on the news is more common. So it's a bit more passive. Now, a few more terms to do with TV news. A roving reporter. Well, a reporter is anyone who reports the news. So newspaper reporters write articles. TV reporters will go around with a microphone normally and they'll talk to the, this isn't a microphone. My actual microphone is down there and I'm speaking into it, so I can't use it as a prop. But they'll go around with a microphone and say, I'm standing outside the scene of the crime now, and there's a lot going on, blah, blah, blah. So they'll be there with a microphone, talking directly into the camera and reporting the news from the scene of the story, or the scene of the crime, if it's a crime story. A correspondent, this is very similar. So a correspondent is a journalist who's placed in a particular area, a reporter who's based in a specific region. So you might have a war correspondent reporting from the front line of the war. You might have an Eastern European correspondent who stays in Eastern Europe and just travels between those countries to stand in the relevant places. There's a foreign correspondent, or each channel has a foreign correspondent in the UK, a royal correspondent as well, who will stand outside Buckingham Palace and give reports from there. And at the end of the broadcast, the news anchors will very often recap the main story. To recap something is just to tell you again briefly what they've already told you. And they'll start that by saying, the headlines again. Because headlines isn't just a newspaper term. It started as a newspaper term, but it's used in TV news as well. So the news will start and they'll take you through the headlines. This wonderful thing has happened. These people have died. The main points, those are the headlines. And at the end, they'll say the headlines again, and they'll run you through them again. So if you tuned in halfway through, you still get to hear the main headlines. So it's a very useful term to use when talking about all kinds of news. Now we get on into the news cycle. The news cycle is just the way that the news keeps on going, keeps coming around, and you get more news until there's no new news to replace that old news. So these days we have what they call rolling news 24 hours a day because it never stops. So any minute of the day you can tune in and get a news report. Some people say that there is too much news being reported, and the reporters have to actually make the news by reporting things that aren't really newsworthy. So if something is newsworthy, it's something that really the people need to know about or want to know about. But if you're reporting about a celebrity doing something fairly minor and fairly private, if you're reporting it as news, some people would say that's not really newsworthy. And you're wasting people's time by reporting that as news. So some people are quite strongly against 24-hour news because they think we end up being told too much information, and it makes it easier to forget the real stories. And back in 1930, there was one particular day, April the 18th, when BBC Radio News came on and they just said, "There is no news today," and played piano music for quarter of an hour or something like that. So it's unthinkable. I can't believe you would do that these days. With 24-hour news, they'd never say there's no news today. but it goes to show how much things have changed, how much our attitude to what is newsworthy has changed. Now, there is such a thing as a slow news day. As a slow news day, there are no big stories, no major scandals, nothing big to report. So reporters don't know what to do, really. So they'll give us a human interest story, just something fairly fun, a bit of fluff, they sometimes say. They'll give us a bit of fluff on a slow news day, like, oh, and here's a short segment about a person who has an unusual pet. Here's a story about a woman who has the largest collection of trombones in Scotland, or just something very unusual. And during silly season, which is actually at the moment in the UK, the government is out of session. The government's all on holiday for the summer. Almost everything is a human interest story. So the news reporters have to find very obscure and strange things to report. The front pages of newspapers are sometimes full of nonsense, or they can dig up older stories, but the government isn't giving them anything to work with because the government's on holiday. So that's silly season, when lots of the stories will be silly, as in really not newsworthy. So some people find this an appealing time of the year because it's wonderful not to have too much politics to think about.